Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event. I'm Fiona Jenkins. I'm the convener of the Gender Institute here at ANU. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also offer my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us here today or listening to our recording. And in a week that's been all about change in our nation, very excited, moves afoot, I want to welcome the steps that our new Prime Minister has already made towards reconciliation by making an Indigenous voice to Parliament one of his first items of business. And I think we all hope to stand together with that as we can in this institution and in our own lives. So welcome to this panel discussion. I think it arrives at a very timely moment to reappraise where we stand in the pandemic. I'd like to let you know that we're recording this discussion and any questions and answers later on, and we'll share that recording on the website. I know that this is not an ideal time of day for a lot of people, and hopefully we can get that resource onto the Gender Institute website. In case any of you are new to the Gender Institute, we're a network that aims to promote the wonderful gender research that happens at ANU. We link into many forms of gender equity work as well. If you would like to know more, just Google us and you can sign up to our newsletter, which has been on a little bit of a pause, but is coming back next week. And it's full of information about anything to do with gender-related events around Canberra as well as the ANU. Now, in a moment, Joyce, my partner in this event from Go Equal, is going to say a few words before we meet our chair, Sally Moyle, and introduce our panel. But let me just first share just a couple of reflections on the pandemic. I mean, clearly there's been a lot of discussion of the disproportionate effect that this has had on women, and there is so much there still to reckon with, I think. And it's sometimes very hard, I think, to know in what tense to write about the pandemic. You know, is it behind us? We kind of want to believe it is, but I kind of feel it's not. I've just been trying to finish an article about home as metaphor during the pandemic, which I started last year, and it's been so hard to find the right way to describe where we're at in this process. But what's certainly the case is the gendered effects of the pandemic are very much with us, and perhaps for bad and good, and I think that's the sort of starting point of this discussion. Of course, the impacts differ very widely based on local context and policy and forms of intersectional disadvantage, and I think some of those themes will come in today. One upside that maybe we see here in Australia, though, is the recognition that childcare is a vital infrastructure. I mean, maybe that's one of the things that's really been brought to the fore by the experiences that we've been through. So I hope we'll not just look at Australia, we're going to take a global perspective this evening. And I'm really glad we chose Arundhati Roy's stirring words to kind of open this discussion, the idea of the pandemic as a kind of portal that somehow we might walk through, some kind of gateway that invites us to think a bit again about futures and what we need in the feminist movement. And really sort of this evening I think is about joining those voices together and having some of that conversation here at ANU. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and let me introduce Joy Das from Go Equal. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Hello, everyone. My name is Joyce Das, and I am the Executive Director and founder of Go Equal, and definitely an ANU alumni. It is an honor to co-host this panel with ANU Gender Institute, and thank you very much for all of you for accepting this invitation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we are meeting, and I pay my respect. For those of you who don't know about Go Equal is quite a new initiative. It is an Australian-based consulting firm that is committed to achieving gender equality globally. We deeply believe in gender inclusion and diversity and collaborate to innovate innovative cutting-edge approaches to empower and enable women to bring real changes in their lives and the community. And we do all these by engaging with feminist principles that are intersectional, inclusive, and transformative. I strongly believe that today's panel is, as Fiona was mentioning, is highly relevant, and it is a timely response to a time when we are all trying to calibrate in a world that is recovering from a global pandemic, or still we are in a global pandemic phase, who knows. COVID-19 has given us new insights of very old gender relations, no matter where we are located geographically, socially, or economically. We know that certain segments of the population almost uniformly across the globe suffered and continue to suffer the impact of the pandemic disproportionately. It has clearly exacerbated pre-existing gender inequalities and discriminatory gender norms. We already know that women have been carrying the burden of this pandemic at a much higher level compared to their male counterparts. But all of this is just the tip of an iceberg, with much larger, deeper, and more complex gender issues buried beneath it. So we are hoping to listen to some of those issues, through this panel discussion. And of course, this requires stronger, multifaceted, deeper engagement of feminist voices from local to global, between global south and global north. However, this is not a simple journey, while the feminist voices are somewhat disconnected between these two worlds. There's still gaps to be filled in, and this is exactly where GoEqual strives to contribute. I would like to thank the panelists for their great contribution to this ongoing discussion, and especially thanks to Dr. Faustina Pereira, who's visiting us at the moment, and for being here. And it is a privilege to be your host in Canberra. Like all of you, I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. So no further words, let's enjoy the wonderful panel. Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Sally Moyle. I'm the Honorary Associate Professor here at ANU with the Gender Institute, and what I now call basically a roving feminist. So I take opportunities to do interesting things when they arise, and this certainly is one of those interesting things. When we had the opportunity to pull a panel together with this amazing group of experts who are doing some really interesting research on the issue of where we're up to in a post-COVID world, I really jumped at the opportunity to help to bring it together. So, and as Fiona said, this is a really interesting time in Australia. We've just, as you know, had a federal election where women, I think we will see in the wash-up as we assess who voted and what the voting patterns were, I think we will see that women have spoken very strongly and said, do not take us for granted. We are, the range amongst women at work trying to manage through the pandemic has really demonstrated that women's time is not elastic, that women cannot continue to keep on giving and giving. And as we've seen with any natural disaster or any human-made disaster, any disaster exacerbates existing inequalities. And it finds the fissures and it finds the fault lines and it gets in there, as a virus does. The virus has found weak points in us as individuals and in us as communities. And likewise, inequality does exactly the same thing. And it takes every opportunity to kind of advance that inequality to prevent change from happening. And we see that time and time again, no matter what the kind of disaster that we're facing. And we've seen that with the pandemic. This can create just another barrier towards achievement of equality in Australia and around the world, both between women and men and also between countries, between developed nations and less developed nations. It will make things worse unless we take deliberate steps to do something differently. And this is always the opportunity and the exciting small hope that we have from any disaster, that we can find a way of changing the way we do things. And this was the beautiful words that Arundhati Roy gave us early on in the pandemic in March. She wrote her op-ed piece that told us that this is a portal, that we can take opportunities to change the way we do things. And then since then, UN Women has produced a guide and toolkit for how we can better deal with the pandemic and how we can deliver gender equality through the pandemic. In less beautiful language, I may say, it's in UN speak, but it is nevertheless a real feminist plan for sustainability and social justice. And it is an opportunity. There's always an opportunity through any disaster for us to do better. And I think right now, 2.5 years into this pandemic, this is a great opportunity for us at ANU to stop and reflect on some of the things that we've learned and some of the ways forward. So, you know, some of the things that we've learned, I have to say, aren't great. You know, why did we not do better? Why are we continuing to make the same mistakes? It's so depressing. So we will be covering off some of the mistakes that we've made and some of the disasters that we've helped to exacerbate through the pandemic. But I'm hoping that we can also find space to take us through that portal and start thinking about how we can do better into the future. So really looking forward to the next 90 minutes, and I'm going to now quickly introduce each of our speakers, and then I will ask each of them to make a very short summary of their points that they'd like to make, and we'll have a conversation through that about some of the interesting things that emerge and the connections between the speakers. If people have burning desires to ask questions, there's not that many of us here that we can't pause and have people put their hands up if you can't wait, and we can stop and have questions as we go. So it's more of a conversation between us and the whole audience, but we'll also leave some room at the end for questions and answers. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Faustina Pereira, who is a practitioner academic, a pracademic. I think you call yourself, Faustina, it's a great word. You're an advocate of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh and a social justice advocate. Faustina applies her feminist lens and specialisations in access to justice, sustainable development and legal empowerment for those most in need of the protection and benefit of the law. Faustina is currently a Senior Fellow, Centre for Peace and Justice, and Professor at BRAC University. In 2006, she was named the Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, and your first book, Fractured Scales, received the Asiatic Society Gold Medal in 2002. Faustina is currently working on her third book, where she aims to capture subaltern voices within the judiciary during British colonial times in the South Asian subcontinent. It's great to have you here, Faustina. Secondly, we've got Dr. Maria Tanyag, who's a fellow and senior lecturer at the Department of International Relations at the Coral Bell School here at ANU. Maria was awarded her PhD from Monash in 2018 and received first-class honours for both her MA and BA honours in political studies from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and has a BA in social science magna cum laude from the University of Philippines in Diliman. She was selected as one of the inaugural International Studies Association's Emerging Global South Scholars in 2019 and as a resident Women, Peace and Security Fellow at the Pacific Forum in 2021. Maria has a forthcoming open access article entitled A Murderous Plague, State Hypermasculinity, COVID-19 and Atrocity Prevention in the Philippines, with the journal Global Responsibility to Protect. And I'm really looking forward to that. And finally, we have Rebecca Monson, who is an interdisciplinary researcher with extensive experience in research and practice. Rebecca is an associate professor at the ANU College of Law at ANU, and she has extensive experience as an academic development consultant and lawyer working on gender equality, justice systems, climate adaptation and emergency management in Australia and the Pacific. Rebecca co-leads the Law, Governance and Institutions node of ANU's Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, and currently holds an Australian Research Council Early Career Researcher Award to examine the ways in which women's movements in the Pacific navigate pluralistic legal systems. Rebecca's book, Gender, Property and Politics in the Pacific, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press this year, and I'm also really looking forward to that one. So I think we've got a really interesting panel who can bring us perspectives from across our region and also from within Australia. And I'm hoping that we have a really happy and open conversation. I'm going to start by asking Faustina to frame up for us the pandemic from a global perspective, but also from your perspective in the South Asian region. Thanks, Faustina.
Thank you very much. Should I just sit this way?
I think just whatever suits you, but yes.
Good afternoon, everyone, and especially thank you to Joyce and Fiona and Sally for organizing this event today. And I would like to thank all of you for being here. I understand there are competing, interests and perhaps plans that you might have for this long weekend, so I particularly appreciate your presence here for that. It's an honor to be here visiting you from Bangladesh, and hopefully I will have an opportunity to interact and work with some of you more deeply in the coming months. As Sally has said, I would simply like to share with you some of my observations. We all are real-time observers of the pandemic. So as a human rights activist based in the Global South, I simply have some observations to share with you today, based primarily also from my day-to-day work as a human rights activist at a grassroots level in South Asia. We've all talked about the disruptions, its positive or negative connotations, and the disproportionate impact on certain members of the population, not only women, but particularly women, and including all those whom we encapsulate within the marginalized segment of the populations, whether they're trans persons, children, people living with various forms of disabilities, or fractured struggles around identity. We understand that the pandemic has not impacted individuals, processes, systems, or structures equally. However, there are certain questions that come to mind. Was this all as unforeseen and unpredictable as we sometimes make it out to be? Is it really a black swan phenomenon, as it has been described by certain authors and media? In my view, it is not a black swan phenomenon, mainly because this is something that has been predicted and warned by epidemiologists and development institutions for quite some time. In fact, just to make sure, I went back to some of my notes, and some of the most, let me see if I have a reference for one of the notes. Yes, this is a 2016 report called by the Commission on Global Health Risk Framework for the Future, called The Neglected Dimension of Global Security, a Framework to Counter Infectious Disease Crisis, 2016. So this was certainly not unpredicted or unforeseen. And yet, why is it that we are still talking about the disproportionate and imbalanced manner in which states have gone about? Almost every state uniformly has gone about managing, not preventing, but certainly managing the fallout of this pandemic. And why is it that we are not only talking about the status quo, which has disproportionately impacted and affected women and children and the marginalized, but in many cases we have gone back in time. We have lost important grounds that we have been able to achieve. Despite the sluggish progress and recovery on the economic fronts in many countries. One of the observations I have for this is because states continue to work within age-old binaries of what I call the public and private dichotomy, or the state and the individual dichotomy, where the public, being the marketplace and being the realm of decision-making, is still primarily considered in masculine terms. And the private still not just considered, but primarily remains the realm where women and children primarily function. So the dynamics and the economics and the labor and decision-making that gets produced in the public and the private still remains primarily dichotomized on power basis. So I believe that is one of the reasons why almost every state uniformly approached COVID management through lockdowns, where there's en masse the withdrawal from the public to the private sphere without adequate consideration or planning given for what happens within the private sphere. The exacerbation of known features of the violence, discrimination, inequality, and disparity that gets manifested and magnified many times over. And I believe that is one of the reasons why states continue to either directly or indirectly divest themselves of the responsibility of what happens in the private sphere. And that is where I believe much more work needs to be done from a rights-based, feminist, and certainly a human rights perspective to recalibrate this discourse on this dichotomy and challenge the dichotomy at its source, where the lines certainly need to be blurred between the two, and where men and women and trans persons as humans are seen as equal actors in all spheres. Quite worryingly, within the very first month since the pandemic was announced, that was on March 11th, 2020, by April of 2020, we already had a new coinage called the shadow pandemic, within just a month, of new forms of violence within the home. First time violence suffered by women, by men who had otherwise never ever given any indication of demonstrating or manifesting those behavior patterns. So I think there is a lot of work to be done and ground to be reclaimed of how we go about that. My other observation is that if we are going to talk about building back and building back better, then there are many, of course, ways in which we can go about it, but my observation is that we can, first of all, go back to the drawing board and see what has worked and what has worked well, and re-emphasize and re-envision that. But from a practical point of view, I would suggest that we also look at the sites of injustice. If it's the private sphere, yes, that is very much the case, but also to look at the sites where justice gets produced. And here I would suggest we look at what I call the big J, the formal justice sector, but very much also the small j, the informal justice sector. As most of us may already know, that 80% of the world's justice production happens outside the courtrooms, in what we call the grassroots justice sector, the informal justice sector. Similarly, if we are looking for other sites of injustice production, which is also in the labor force, that also primarily takes place in the informal labor sector. So going back to the drawing board of looking for where we draw our identity from, our legal identity, our economic identity, our financial resources, our accessibility to the markets, I think that is extremely important. Sally, have I crossed my 7 minutes? Or?
Yes, but you make the points you need to make, Faustina.
I will then end on a philosophical note. But before my philosophical note, I would suggest that we also look at the global frameworks that we have already at our hand. And here, I would suggest we look at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. All the goals are important and they need to work in tandem. However, goals 5 around inequalities, particularly around gender inequalities, and goal 16 on equilibrium of justice as the basis for making all the other goals work, including goal 17, where we are talking about the responsibility of all states, not just poorer states, but rich and poor states in upholding their responsibilities to the citizens. And now comes my philosophical point, where I feel that we need to combine certain approaches. Yes, we are talking about a feminist plan, and I fully endorse the UN piece that has just been launched. I think it's called the COVID-19 Recovery through Sustainability and Social Justice. I really endorse that. I would like to pair that with another perspective that has been around for many decades, 6 decades almost. It's the Paulo Freirean approach to conscientization, understanding truly what the pedagogy of the oppressed is, and looking at the sites of oppression, which may look different from 1960, but these are also the newer forms of sites of oppression that get created within the private sphere in our individual lives. Yes, and so pairing these two perspectives, I believe, will help us to make the practical work for everyone, because of our human identity, and not because only we are men or women or children or trans. I will leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Faustina. Maria, can you give us your overview of the work that you've been doing and your perspectives on these questions?
Thank you, Sally. I'd also join my co-panelists in thanking Gender Institute and Go Equal for organizing this. This is absolutely an important conversation that we should be having. Thank you to my co-panelists, because already with Faustina writing too clear notes and a lot to learn. Yeah, and thank you for being here. As Sally mentioned, my perspectives will stem from looking at, in particular, the Philippines as an acute case of the pandemic, and as well drawing on my disciplinary training in international relations. So I look at Philippines, but as a way to make sense of global processes. And as Sally mentioned, some of the insights that I'll be sharing is included in a forthcoming article on state hypermasculinity. I think jumping on from what Faustina mentioned, I also think that the early warning signs for the pandemic was in plain sight, hidden in plain sight. And in particular for me, it started in 2016 when Duterte was elected, and alongside that, Trump was elected. And globally, there was an interest in the resurgence of authoritarian strongman leaders. So you had Trump, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Modi, and so on. We might even think of including Boris Johnson in the UK and ScoMo here. But let's not go there, we're glad it's done. But the early warning signs was there, right? And for feminists, and especially human rights activists, they were already signaling the alarm that the world is being led by these types of leaders, and crises will happen. And your leaders then are these sort of people. And I'll explain more about what I mean by why that was an early warning sign. But in total, when we try and understand the pandemic, and as Faustina mentioned, there's a prevailing narrative that these types of crises are unique, exceptional, sui generis, that we need to understand them as these spectacular events that gravitate political attention and tremendous resources. However, feminist perspectives would alert us in terms of the structural and discursive connections across all forms of crises, whether they are pandemics, armed conflicts, environmental disasters, and climate change. There are structural connections across them. And feminist perspectives, I argue, are very good at revealing those connections. And in this particular set of structural and discursive connections, I focus on the concept of state hypermasculinity. So hypermasculinity in this instance is not just about the sex of the leaders. And we've heard a lot about that already, right? That there's emerging evidence that women leaders were in many ways more effective in managing the pandemic. My position departs from that slightly in emphasizing the structural effects of hypermasculinity. And here I point out two main processes. First is that in response to crises, and not just the COVID pandemic, but certainly we have seen it acutely, is the tendency that the template for crisis response is militarized crisis response. And all over the world, and in particular the Philippines, the pandemic was heavily militarized, such that security was seen as emerging from
and being produced by the military and the police. And we've seen the mass deployment of the military and the police. And indeed, there's evidence that in the past 2 years, we've seen rapid increase of military spending globally. And so at the time of the pandemic, a health crisis, one would argue, we've actually seen an increase in military spending. And what are the trade-offs of this, the structural effects of this? The structural effects, as feminist scholars have always argued, is that when we view security in very narrow and militarized terms, there is a trade-off of human security, of feminist informed peace and security being sidelined and seen as not relevant. And it's particularly in these moments of crisis when we see that intensification of seeing that the only way to get out of a crisis is through a militarized response to a crisis. And as we have been seeing, there are dangerous effects of deploying military and police. And here I say with a heavy heart, and in relation to the concept of justice, that in the Philippines, the militarized response was very deadly. And I use the concept, a murderous plague, because under the Duterte administration, the pandemic was even seen as an opportunity to kill human rights defenders, to target and exacerbate state repression. And here we've seen, how the pandemic has been used as an opportunity for violence. And no wonder, right? And the spectrum that we are talking about in terms of state hypermasculinity and its structural effects, when we have in particular parts of the world strict lockdowns and people working from home, in other parts of the world, these strict lockdowns literally were punitive and murderous. And there have been emerging evidence already in the case of the Philippines. And one of the most horrific instances of human rights violations was that poor people, particularly with the most vulnerable, because of the strict lockdowns, with no access to relief, no automatic cutting off of their livelihood, often in informal sectors anyway, they were literally forced to either beg or die of hunger and then no access. And so these sort of compounding and cascading forms of violence and insecurities. And one of the images that have always haunted me as well is that some of the lockdown violators were even locked up in dog cages because the prisons were already full. And this is under the time of Duterte. This is not already surprising because there's, again, the early warning signs were already there since he started. There were also images and reports of how human rights workers and especially health workers themselves were targeted of violence. Many of them faced violence from their own communities because of the belief that they were spreading the virus. Some of them were also, faced violence, and again, reports of this have been mounting, and important to make this accountable. The dangers, as I mentioned, in terms of really militarizing a pandemic response, is it harkens those sort of military logics as well, and in particular, the idea of collateral damage. And now we are 2 years into the pandemic. How many lives lost? 2 million, more than 2 million, that's the last one. Millions of lives lost in the pandemic, and all of these human rights violations. In a militarized logic, these are collateral damage. And it is rendered as normal in times of crisis because this is a pandemic that was unprecedented. Well, this was something that we never really knew how to manage, and so these sort of things have happened. The second point I want to emphasize in terms of really conceptualizing state hypermasculinity is also the automatic response in terms of seeing the state as a benevolent paternal figure. And how globally, and in particular in the Philippines, and I could talk about the social-cultural foundations of this, we looked at state leaders as automatically, we have given our state leaders as automatic power over us. In this logic of state hypermasculinity, the structural effects was the foreclosing of deliberation and debate. And because the state is seen as the rightful authority, it then had the sole right to determine what security ought to be and how it should be deployed. And in that, we've seen foreclosures of debate and challenging state authority. And in the most granular level, in the case of the Philippines, this has meant that civil society and society more broadly was seen as expected to acquire subordinate role. So when there is an idea, especially in times of crisis, that the state is a paternal authority, as a father of the nation, the role of its citizens is to submit, to obey, and to not challenge that authority. And here again, evidence from the Philippines is that health workers have time and time again challenged that the militarized response is not fit for purpose. You need a whole range of perspectives. You need to engage different sectors. But the response was to actually close that. No, hard rule, hard lockdown, this is how we do it. And again, the cycle of foreclosing the liberation, then the impacts of the pandemic was even more harsh, even harsher, even more prolonged, such that the Philippines was in one of the in COVID indices was recorded as the worst place to be in the pandemic. Not only in terms of its prolonged lockdowns, not only in terms of the cumulative cascading socioeconomic impacts, but precisely because of how deadly it was. There were deliberate costs to physical security for anyone who questioned and wanted change in terms of the pandemic response. And so I know it's heavy stuff, and I know it's very difficult, and I've been in great pains to even write this paper and do that research. And I know a lot of my colleagues here share that same feeling of how difficult was it, and kind of thinking about, well, what is the role of the academic in terms of making, and us in our privileged positions, in making sense of this. And it's absolutely, I think, to really pierce through and challenge that narrative that the pandemic was special, or that it was exceptional. Because then, as I mentioned, it breeds all of these exceptionalisms, when in fact our job is to call out how much of this pandemic have been structurally driven by policies, by leaders, and by us as well, our complicity in electing these sort of leaders, in willingly subordinating our authority. But also at the same time that the costs are not borne evenly. And in here, I really want to emphasize that this pandemic, we see a whole spectrum of violence and insecurities for particular people.
Thank you. That's so fascinating, and clearly there's resonances in the context in Australia as well as elsewhere, and it's something that we'll dig deeper into. But right now, I just want to pass over to Rebecca, who will take us both to the Pacific, but also start thinking about some of the forces of colonisation as well, and the impacts of that in terms of setting us up for the situation that we're in now. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Sally, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm just struck by the commonalities in what the three of us are thinking and talking about, so I'll try and kind of tease out some of the key threads and also situate them in the Pacific and a little bit in Australia. So one of the things I wanted to say was that this absolutely, I completely agree that there's nothing about this that was remotely unforeseen. We have known for a long time that this is precisely the kind of experience humanity might have with climate change. Like, pandemics have long been linked to climate change, and so it is disturbing that we continue to talk about them as something unforeseen when we could be facing a lot more of them. And again, they were not, to link with Maria's point about the hollowing out of the state, again, we see that they were not unforeseen, because we knew in Australia, we had reports that said our pandemic plans were outdated and needed to be dealt with, and that wasn't done. And I know that when countries, across the world, countries started closing their borders and imposing various emergency measures like closing schools, locked stay-at-home orders, things like that. In March 2020, my mind immediately went, for some reason, to the public housing towers in Melbourne. And so, and I don't work in that place. I went to uni in Melbourne. I hung out in the public housing towers and things like that. But it's not something I would normally immediately think about. And yet, I immediately started thinking, my goodness, like, what a place to be during all of this happening. And it was just extraordinary to me that when there were outbreaks in those towers, nothing seemed to have been planned. And I don't think that is an accident. I think that is absolutely part of the kinds of systems that we are talking about here, because the residents of those towers have been saying for a very long time, we're worried about what's happening here. They've been proposing measures, and it seemed to have been largely ignored by the institutions, the organisations, the authorities that might have been in a position to actually do something about it. So having said that, I wanted to start with just the commonalities that we have seen globally, because as a scholar, I'm kind of inclined to look for the differences and to question the global stories that we tell, particularly about gender. But towards the end of 2020, I was doing some work for a large international donor and looking at some of the data that we had at that point in time, produced by UN Women, amongst others. And one of the things that just kept striking me was these commonalities across the world. And we could ask why these commonalities were there. Like, maybe it's because of the way we collect data and the frames we're using, so we produce the data that we expect to see. But one of the things that did strike me were these consistent themes, like women across the globe did seem to be reporting increased poverty due to their time at home, increased time poverty due to the time spent at home caring. There seemed to be a gendered increase in the risk of infection because women are more likely to do the care work in the home and are more likely to be in the caring professions like nursing. And in many contexts, we did seem to see a rise in gender-based violence. There were increased calls to domestic violence hotlines in pretty much every context globally. And of course, this again coincided with the kind of phenomena that Maria has highlighted, and it gets back to Faustina's points about justice systems and how we're conceptualising them and resourcing them. This rise in demand for these formal services coincided with restrictions on them. They had often already had funding withdrawn over many years, and now they had their ability to provide services with their limited resources further compromised and faced an enormous increase in demand. Another thing that I really noticed in these global reports that were being pumped out in 2020 was the definition of gender that was being employed. And for the reports for the context that I work in, it would usually start with women, and then there would be a list that typically included children, the elderly, youth, people with disabilities. There is a striking lack of information globally about the experiences of SOGI people or LGBTQIA+ people. The data that we have overwhelmingly focuses on women and girls, and if you read it closely, the assumption seems to be that we are talking about cisgender women and girls in heterosexual relationships. So we don't know a lot, we are not talking a lot about the experiences of these people that just then get lumped together as other people that we also should be talking about, but we're not going to right now because we're constrained with our resources. And for me, this always gets back to the point that Faustina and Maria have both made about the fact that we need to be talking about gendered places, processes, and structures. We can't remain stuck in, what scholars would call liberal feminism. And I think we need to, and when I talk about liberalism, I mean both the ways in which we do organise ourselves and the fact that we, and I'm a white woman in settler colonial Australia, we conceive ourselves as an individual first and foremost, instead of embedded in these networks and relationships as kin. And it's how we also understand our own assumptions about the world and the data that we've got. And so we keep getting stuck in producing these checklists of vulnerable groups, and then we have to make decisions with limited resources about which groups that we're going to prioritise. And then, of course, those groups need to be empowered or have their capacity built rather than the actual structures that constrain them dealt with. So to give you an example, let's take the cisgendered heterosexual couple that has been the subject of these global reports. The man will often work in a highly masculinised workplace. We could say something like the Department of Treasury or Defence in Canberra. Their colleagues are likely to be predominantly men or have historically been predominantly men. There may be a workplace culture of very long hours. There may be resistance to moving to working from home. No matter how enlightened this individual man and his partner are, they are both going to face enormous struggles in restructuring their home and work lives in order to deal with remote schooling and everything else that has come with COVID-19. in my work, I've been thinking a lot about the regulation of property and how it's foundational to these processes. So I'm interested that Maria is also working with concepts of the hypermasculine state, because this is where I have arrived too with processes of colonisation and the regulation of property. So in the context that I work in the Pacific, the legal we typically talk about customary law, tradition, and sometimes religion as the problem for women in the Pacific. And yet I would argue that it is the legal construction and regulation of communities, and particularly their property, that is the core problem that many people face. We see processes where men who fit particular models of masculine leadership, so it's not all men, it's these people who fit particular models of leadership, are the ones who tend to end up controlling land through court processes, for example, and in contexts where social and political life is fundamentally structured by extractive industries. You're going to have a process where the people that control resources at the local level are going to be the people who also end up in Parliament. And so you have processes of masculinisation trekking backwards and forwards between the central Parliament and your villages, essentially. So you have this ongoing loop. And this too links with the hollowing out of the state. Colonisation consistently told people you need to be looking to the state to be doing certain things for you, and you should do away with custom and all of this stuff. And yet, of course, during COVID-19, it has often been those spaces, those sites that people have been able to return to, reinvigorate, or build up even more than they had before. But I might leave it there because I think there's some really key threads coming out of what the three of us have said.
Thank you, Rebecca. And that just gives us the very beginning of the thinking about where we can go from here. But before we get into some of those solutions and opportunities for hope, I also just wanted to bring us around to some work that Maria's been doing about women as feminised others and the way that women's bodies have been kind of put at the front line, cannon fodder really, for the pandemic.
Absolutely. Sorry. And that is part of also the state hypermasculinity and the structural effects of it. Is that for the state to exist through hypermasculine logics, it has to create its feminized others, and often feminized being often women's bodies, but of course this has in the pandemic feminized sectors too. And paradoxically, at a time when the need for health and care is at its most intense, it is also when that very source of care and health is depleted. And here again, depletion of care and health occurs in very violent ways. So the work that, more recent work that I've been looking is really following up on what was the care that was given and received by healthcare workers themselves, and also women's rights service providers. Again, starting in Philippines, but also elsewhere. We've seen, and there have been reports of this, including from the Lancet, that they were themselves target of violence and discrimination and stigma. And that for many of them, they are enduring invisible forms of harms, mental health, depression, PTSD, and fatigue, and so on. And again, this is important if we're thinking about justice. So they are on the front lines, but then that also meant that we need to urgently look at the kind of violence and long-term effects that are borne by their bodies. And if we're thinking about, again, that there will always be another crisis, and in the way in which we have responded with this pandemic, we know that we are no longer better prepared, no better prepared for the next one. Because as we have seen increase in military spending, increase in terms of really subordinating deliberative dialogue processes in terms of security decision making. And here again, I think starting from the lives of health, what sort of carers received is very foundational to how we rethink this pandemic. So the question that I asked in this other work is, who cares for the carers? And I think that is a very important litmus or barometer for how we are recovering in this pandemic, because
again, amongst the most visible signs for this in drawing on the Philippines is that for a country so known for exporting care workers globally, Filipinos are known globally as, you know, if you look at any country, you'll see nurses from Philippines and so on. But yet its own country, the source of that very export of care was drastically targeting its own healthcare workers. And there was even a point, immediately a few months after the pandemic, the government decided to impose a travel ban. That we're not going to send out our care workers because you need to serve here first. And of course, this is an important human rights violations because counted as human rights violations, and healthcare workers themselves were framing it as a human rights violation. Why? Because they were already being battered, and many of them dying in the pandemic response with inefficient and inadequate PPEs available to them. At the same time, being targeted for violence and discrimination when they were challenging or opposing the government for its and reporting failures in the pandemic response. And also at the very granular level, you had community healthcare workers who weren't properly paid even before the pandemic, and yet you are preventing them from going overseas to find a better life. But then the global connections is that globally, we know that healthcare and the paid care economy is a racialized sector. And so globally, there is data now, including from the Lancet, that the mortality around care workers have been along racial lines. So a lot of people of color died, healthcare workers died in the pandemic. And so this is a fundamental inequality and injustice that is important to bring into this sense of how are we recovering and are we recovering.
And again, the resonance here is striking with Australian context, of course. You know, around the world, everybody was, you know, saying thank you to the health workers, but then through our election, raise the minimum wage. I don't think so, ladies, because clearly it is mostly women who are on the minimum wage. So it was a striking demonstration of that difference between, we will expect you to be the frontline cannon fodder, but we will not change any of the structures or even think about changing the structures in order to address the issues that have been highlighted. I mean, it's really been a wonderful exposition, I think, of a bit of a trot around our region and the globe about how depressingly foreseen this was. So we've been talking about a pandemic for at least a decade in my experience, and we should have been better prepared. And we've been talking about the gendered implications of every disaster for the last 20 years, as far as I've been working on it at least, and longer than that. And again, we consistently and blindly overlook them. I mean, it's just so infuriating that I think there's some room for us to begin to hope, I think, and to use this as an opportunity to really say, look, let's never do this again. Let's avoid these mistakes. And I think, Faustina, you put your finger first on it when you're talking about the lines between public and private. And clearly that's at the heart of the patriarchy, and it always has been, hasn't it? The ability to say that the home belongs to, is the Englishman's castle, and that he is responsible for what happens there. It's not our space, and you can do whatever you like. And that it's entirely elastic, and it's elastic on the backs of women's labour and time. And there's so much resistance to the state intervening in the private sphere, in the home, right? And unless it's about abortion, when it's fine. But I think that's the position, that's a line that is very hard to cross. And even though in Australia we saw, for example, one of the first things that our government did in the pandemic response was to introduce free childcare, they soon, realised the error of their ways and withdrew it before any of the other pandemic response measures were withdrawn. So, it's not easy for governments to kind of step into providing support for women's time. But Faustina, that's a sort of a demonstration of the effects of the patriarchy, right? But we've also talked about capitalism, globalism, rising authoritarianism and colonialism. we've seen that people are kind of in the face of this fear of a pandemic or other disaster, people are willing to give up some of their human rights, it seems, and to a strong leader in the face of a crisis. But can you tell us how you see a power analysis of that situation, and a gender lens can help us understand why this keeps happening and what we can do about it?
How much time do I have? This is I think a discourse unto itself. I don't think I can do it justice in this time frame, but it's, as you were framing your question, I was thinking we live in a rather very paradoxical time, and I've been feeling this for some decade, or at least a decade now, is that since the Second World War, the legal and justice frameworks within which we function, we have the highest level of conscientization and language, rights-based language than ever before, and yet the highest level of rights violation. So what's going on here? Is it this disingenuity? I don't know if that's a word, but is it as universal as patriarchy is? No. And I think patriarchy is as successful as an archy or an ism compared to the other isms.
Faustina, I always used to say that the only thing that trumps capitalism is patriarchy.
Patriarchy
People will defer their capitalist and their financial interests in order to maintain the patriarchy.
True. I think, and the reason why it is as resistant is because it again comes back to the individual, the personal. It's deeply personal. It is the one ism or archy that touches us to the core compared to the other isms, isn't it? At least that's how I see it, because this is the one ism that requires more than other isms in order to dismantle it. And here we are talking maybe master's house, master's tools, etc. To look at the mirror. If you really, and Rebecca, when you were talking about property, if we only simply use this one indicator, we see how difficult it is to dismantle the master's house with the same tools that we have at our hands. Property goes to the core of your human individual interest. Like, I come from a community where it is much more blatant, where the succession lines are primarily male bloodlines. So in most cases, a woman may have a right to property on paper, but not in reality. And socializations have worked around continuing the discrimination. So, and we just have literally one planet.
Yeah.
We have one planet, one cohort of population, and a lot of appetite for profit. So if you put all these three P's, people, planet, profit, guess which trumps? Yeah. Yes. So I think that is one of the reasons why patriarchy is so resilient. So whatever isms we may talk about, in order to dismantle patriarchy as we understand it, will require, I think, hollowing out almost every system that we know, including family structure. So are we going to go that route, or maybe re-envision and rebuild and maybe reclaim and renew the whole discourse, the whole conversation of how we understand patriarchy? Maybe we don't have to go the matriarchy route, but we talk about more the human, the human route, and how do we go about that? And I think the feminist perspective is clearly a way to go, because and I came across this wonderful quote by Mary Robinson just before I arrived today, and I think that is where she's talking about climate change and climate justice, of course, but this is equally applicable here, where she says that patriarchy or man-made is generic, but a feminist solution is many strands of feminism that incorporates the problem-solving approach. It is non-hierarchical listening. It serves those whom you have a responsibility for and really caring about their needs. It is a solution that men must embrace more and more, and I say we all must embrace more and more. And one of the reasons why patriarchy is as resilient and successful is because we as women are the vehicles of patriarchy. So we are, whether unwittingly or knowingly, the vehicles of patriarchy, because it is human interest at the end of the day. So I think this non-hierarchical listening and putting or bringing to the table those in whose names we are putting forth laws, processes, systems, institutions, their voices, their choices, their agency, our agency must be represented at the table.
Thank you.
So not speaking for, but with.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. And we're now heading towards our time, unfortunately. I wish we could spend another hour on this, but I'm going to just ask each of our speakers to just give us, based on that inspiring thought about a feminist future, if we had to take one step forward now to start dismantling the Master's House, what step would we take? Which direction should we go from here? And I'm going to ask you all to just speak for 1 or 2 minutes max so that we can leave some time for some questions. So, Marina, what do you think?
I think the lessons from my own work, I think, is definitely strong on really understanding care, and as an antithesis to hypermasculinity. The hypermasculine state cannot perpetuate itself if we challenge it, and if we really name its modalities, and where it all coalesce and converge is in the way in which we incorporate, we value, and we resource care at its different levels. And on the side of that care is also joy and love. Right? A lot of feminists have been writing on this, especially during the time of the pandemic, and we are still in. But the tendency to actually look for fear and to look for all the negative that pervades and that hypermasculine leaders thrive on. They thrive on fear. And so challenging that by focusing on joy and love is perhaps, and I know it sounds very hippie, but perhaps lessons from the field signal that.
I absolutely so agree with you. I mean, we know that authoritarianism thrives on fear. That's what it eats fear, So that's great. Rebecca, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to sound equally hippie and say
that's great.
Decolonisation. It is no surprise that the countries in the Pacific that experienced the worst impacts of COVID earliest on included Guam and French Polynesia, who were not able to close their borders. Meanwhile, I don't want to romanticize the experience of our nearest neighbours, but they were able to keep COVID at bay long enough that people could be vaccinated, and that has made a fundamental difference. And respect for communities, whether we're talking about people in public housing in Melbourne or Indigenous communities in Western New South Wales or villages in Solomon Islands, people have organised themselves to respond to this in incredibly creative ways, and often they've been really compromised by the central state. The state has not been helpful. The state has squashed the things they have done and has often compounded existing problems. And so in the communities that I'm most familiar with, it was often a return. Yes, there was investment in health, and we need all of that, and it's great that Australia might be doing more about that now. But people reinvigorated long-standing models of exchange relations, of even things as specific as mask wearing. So one of my friends was telling me about how they were talking about masks, and they had masks historically. They had lockdowns in villages that were even lockdowns around houses. None of that would be effective in many contexts in the Pacific unless people want to do it themselves. And we really need a shift in the way we think about managing these crises. We don't want these securitized, militarized responses where we rely on police, on law enforcement to do everything. We need to trust people to organize themselves. And that is not to say that communities are like these homogenous, egalitarian sites of egalitarianism, but it is to acknowledge that people can do things in those spaces that might not be possible elsewhere.
And interestingly, in the Pacific, people are still so much more connected to land, to community and to subsistence that it can happen. It'd be a great case study.
Exactly. So for those of you that aren't aware, at the start of the pandemic, a lot of governments across the region facilitated the return, both central governments and like more local level governments, facilitated the return home of people from urban areas to their villages, precisely because they are understood and experienced as sites of security where people can garden. They're sites of existential security as well. And of course, people can do that because they do still have their land, in contrast to other contexts globally.
Thank you. And Faustina, last word to you.
I can't match hippie. Perhaps I can share an insight from my experience so far at the grassroots, but also working around the framing of Goal 16 of the SDGs, which has come through very clearly, is where we have lost out in the creation of a rights-based master's house, is that we have focused primarily on the needs-based approach to the solution of our human condition, and have not aligned it to the rights alongside needs. So that disconnect, I think, accounts for the chasm that we see here, where authoritarian leaders will go for the hands first, or hands meaning, authoritarian needs-based approaches rather than the head or the heart. And I think bringing all these together, needs and the rights in alignment, will be a truly human rights-based and feminist approach to the future.
Thank you. Now we've got some time for a couple of questions. We could keep on going, but I'm going to pause here and ask the audience if we've got any questions. Yes.
So my name's Irene. I work at College of Arts and Social Sciences in the Business Development team. And I've been looking at incredible young women like Grace Kane, Higgins, Thunberg, Moyle, and thinking about the ways that structures can harm those young women when they speak out. And looking at the context of gender justice and the incredible brains that we have in the panel here, I really love your advice, your thoughts, the ways that the discipline of gender justice can actually help us to wrap around these young women that speak out as they renew these spaces, as they reclaim some of these voices. What are your thoughts?
Okay, now.
I've given you a simple question.
Thanks, Irene. So I'm going to repeat the question for the purposes of the recording. Irene said she's looking at incredible young women like Grace Tane, Brittany Higgins, Greta Thunberg, and the harm that they suffer when they speak out. How can we, in a caring society, as feminists, wrap around them to support them and enable their voices? Any thoughts on that?
I think I could jump in because I've also been following Greta Thunberg. There's been a lot of Twitter spat between her and Trump, and precisely because she gets under the nerves of having masculine leaders. And I've seen the same in Philippines with Duterte, and how easily he imprisoned a lot of female political opponents and have ridiculed them precisely because, especially young women. At the start of the pandemic too, there was in Philippines a young woman who organized community pantries, and immediately young woman, immediately the state branded her as an enemy and that she's causing trouble. And it's precisely this, the power of young women speaking up is that the center cannot hold. Like all of a sudden, it's like, how dare you, right? But here then I think a feminist response was to really look at the cost of speaking up And there is a strong emphasis on women's political participation, and especially in our region. But what is the cost of that? And the costs, again, as I've mentioned, range from direct attacks to physical security, imprisonment, and so on, to misogyny online, right? And so we need then to have the fit for purpose range of human rights protections for young women to speak up and create a culture, right? And this is exactly what we need. But at the same time, we don't want young women speaking up and then they're left on their own, right? That they suddenly bear the full force of these hypermasculine structures and processes, because then no one else will speak up, right? And then no one else will come forward to challenge that. So I think they have to go together.
I agree. And you know, I have to say, I think one of the points at which the wash-up of our just recent election will demonstrate that the government lost the election when Scott Morrison addressed Brittany Higgins. Jenny told me to think of it as a father, and you know, the patriarch that has silenced women for so long. I think that women around the country just went, yeah, no, no way, mate. You know, that's not the sort of support and the care that we need. And I think it was really, really interesting from that point of view. Have we? I think we've got time for another question or two, or unless there's other thoughts on that particular topic. Okay. Yes, we've got somebody at the back.
I have a question for Faustina. You made a statement that was something like 80% of justice gets produced at the grassroots level or community level.
Yes.
Could you say a bit about what that means, what you meant?
Yes.
And do you see it as a source of hope or as yet another problem?
Yes, I will just repeat the question. So our question is to Faustina. 80% of justice, Faustina said, is at the community level or informal level. Faustina was asked to expand on that point and identify whether she thinks it's a source of hope or a source of whether it's a negative.
Yes, thank you. I will be as succinct as possible. It is already well established and recorded that at least 80%, so it could clearly be more, even 90% in some contexts, of justice deliberations or dispensation of justice that takes place outside of the formal courtroom. It takes place primarily at the community level and what we refer to as the customary justice level or customary justice system. In some countries, it takes place under a baobab tree. In other communities, including mine, it's known as shalish or customary informal systems of redressal. The reason why most the justice gets produced and dispensed out so much outside of the formal courtroom is because of many reasons. One is that it is easily accessible. Within the community, if you have a justice system, say in the form of an alternative dispute resolution or arbitration or negotiation, whatever you term it, if you have it in your neighborhood, it is more likely that you will go to your neighborhood council rather than walk or trek at great uncertainty and expense, maybe 50 kilometers to the next town to get justice. And also, most people will go to a community that they're already familiar with, that they understand, that they know, and have the means to implement the verdict. In most systems, apart from a few countries, you have, even I would say in developed countries, you need an interpreter to explain to you what that verdict is all about, which is not necessarily the case in an informal justice system. So these are some of the factors that go into why people will primarily go to their immediate community to redress an injustice or an unfairness rather than go to the great expense and length and uncertainty of the formal justice system. So that is, now as to your second part of the question, whether that's better or worse, I would not perhaps dwell on that here, but I would raise another question, is what then is the mainstream?
Yeah.
when we talk about mainstream justice, if 80% of it is getting produced outside of the formal structure, we come back to the question of the master's house and who is actually running the justice system. And you see much more feminized processes of justice making outside of the formal justice system. It's in that minimum 80%. So I think if we can look at that outside, that's what I refer to as the small j rather than the big J. If we can look at that small j much more closely and infuse a more egalitarian and equitable rights-based justice-making processes, I think we have a way forward.
Got time for one more question? Any final thoughts, questions? No? Well, then in that case, we might just begin to wrap up and say, are there any final thoughts from any of the panel? Anything that you would like to leave us with, Maria?
I'm okay, yeah.
Rebecca?
Oh, I just amplified what Faustina was saying and say that it's not so much a matter of better or worse, but it's a matter of looking at everything that is in operation in front of us, everything that we're a part of, and identifying the strengths and weaknesses and the variable experiences and try and maximise the good bits. Too often, I think that we have slipped into an assumption that the state can save us, whether we're talking central government or formal legal systems, and the pandemic has shown us, for many of us it was not a surprise, but the pandemic has shown us that there is a lot else that we need to be thinking about as well and drawing out the strengths of that.
Faustina, final thoughts?
Just to say thank you, and that we emphasize the us rather than the them and us, and that we are all in it together, and it is ultimately we're talking about the recalibrating and bettering the human condition rather than the condition of only one segment over the other.
And so for me, just to say thank you all to all three of you. It's been a fabulous conversation. I think that the panel has been perfectly matched in terms of the expertise that you bring and the thoughts that you have, and the intersections between those thoughts as well really amplify each other's positions. And for me, I really am struck by I'm an old hippie at heart, Maria, and so I really agree with you that the only antidote to the situation that we see ourselves in after decades, and many in the audience will know, have worked with me on this, decades of banging on those doors and making those points again and again. And I often say that the feminist movement has done the research, we've produced all of the reports, we've brought you the evidence time after time after time after time over the last 5, 6, 7 decades, millennia, hundreds of years. There is a business case, there is an argument for gender equality, and the fact that it is so often ignored and overlooked is, as you say, no accident. It's no accident. And the only antidote to it, I think, I kind of gave my career to working within the system in order to dismantle that system and change it from within. A risk that I don't know paid off, but I think the only answer for us is not only to continue knocking at those doors, because you can see change happen sometimes, but also to reinvent that culture of care and fight fear with care. I think that's and that means both bringing to the foreground the work that women do in their families and in the private sphere that is so often treated as elastic and able to be expanded forever, exponentially, without any effect. We know that it has an effect, and in Australia we have our time use survey, our 4th time use survey in the field, and hopefully we'll be beginning to see the evidence coming out in the next year around the way that women's time is so tightly wound, that everything happens at the expense of women's time, and that women are now suffering. Their health is suffering, their psychological health is suffering, their careers and their financial security is suffering. It's not infinitely elastic. It is just not. And we have women in Australia certainly have said, we've come to the end of our tether. Thanks very much. That must change. So I think the unpaid work sphere must be brought to the foreground, and also the care sector and the care economy that was so often talked over when you know, our politicians went out in their high-vis vests to build yet another infrastructure program at the expense of our care economy, where we create and recreate our society. So I absolutely agree with you that I think the notion of care needs to be brought to the foreground, and I think we can do it. I mean, it's, you know, we heard monkeypox has hit us now, and the level of fear that people had and the lack of learning that anybody has taken from our pandemic in order to do things differently is just striking again. We would do exactly the same thing again, I'm sure, when the next pandemic inevitably comes. So in the meantime, I think we've just got to keep on focusing on that economy of care and the culture of care, and keep on going. But I really wanted to thank everybody for coming. Fiona or Joyce, did you have any final thoughts or anything you needed to tell us?
No, but I think, you know, it's a really interesting theme that's coming through. That, you know, what the meaning of the pandemic is depends upon the sort of modes of response to it. You know, it's so dependent on the multiple sites at which that's negotiated, and recognising that multiplicity is actually really important in relation to the, you know, the assumption somehow that strongman tactics are the only way to deal with this kind of thing. So I found that a really fascinating thread in your conversation.
Okay, well, I think we will draw this to a close. I think we're going to retire to the pub, are we not?
Yes.
Yes.
And Badger and Co.
Badger and Co. If anybody's able to join us for a drink, that's where we're going now.
That's how we start caring.
So with that, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.